Welcome to episode 4 of Path to Med. I'm your host, Suhani, and my guest today is Nikhil Desai, who's a medical student at the Medical College of Wisconsin and also a content creator known for his engaging content on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. His content often involves tips for pre-med students, study strategies, and stories about his experiences in medical school. So it's really nice to have you on today's episode.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That was such a nice introduction.
So, just to start off the interview, what inspired you to pursue a career in medicine?
I think there are like a few things that probably inspired me. I can't think of just like one. I think one of the biggest things growing up is I was always very curious about everything. I kind of just wondered how things worked. And I remember even in as early as elementary, middle school, when we started to learn a little bit about science or the human body, it was just fascinating to me. I remember in fifth grade, my grandpa told me that he had heart surgery before, and I was like, whoa, like what's that? We kind of had this, like, I was in fifth grade, so I was young, right? And we had this conversation about it, but I ended up doing like a school project on like heart surgery in fifth grade, and obviously it wasn't anything like fancy, but it really got the ball rolling with regards to like thinking about science and medicine. And honestly, ever since then, I really kind of always wanted to be a doctor. I also played sports, so I think for a period of time I wanted to be an athlete. When I realized I wasn't good enough to play sports like in college or professionally, I kind of really focused more on like the school side. But I think the biggest thing for me was just like this curiosity. And then moving as I got older, I realized being in medicine, you really get challenged and you really have opportunities to learn that I didn't have or I didn't feel like I would have in other fields. And maybe that's something we can get into later. But I think like in medicine, one of the coolest aspects is obviously you learn all this information about the body, but a huge part of the job, I guess it depends on the specialty, but a huge part of the job is also how do you communicate that information to a patient sitting in front of you? How do you know what to say to which patient based off of their temperament or their background or their understanding of medicine? And that challenge or like that art of the communication side of medicine, as I got older into undergrad and now in medical school, I find very intriguing as well. So I think that's the best part about it for me, and kind of why I'm still passionate about it is like there's all these opportunities to learn in a lot of different ways. And then at the end of the day, you're treating patients, right? And you're impacting people when they're at a very vulnerable point in their lives. And there's a huge responsibility and opportunity that comes with that. So I think it's kind of evolved over time for me and sort of my interest in medicine.
I mean, this is kind of like the job that you're going to be doing for the rest of your life. So you have to be passionate about it if you want to go to school for like that long to study it. But what are some of the reasons that it might not be a good career path for everyone?
No, that's a really good question. I think people don't think about that as much as they probably should. I think what you touched on earlier is a big part of it. Like, it's not like you go to college and then, like, maybe a year or two after, and then you're working. No, like, I'm a little unfamiliar with the Canadian system, but at least in America, it's like 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, and then 3 to 7+ years of residency before you even get your first, like, real job as an attending or, like, head doctor, like lead doctor. So that time commitment is one thing. I think another big thing is a lot of people think about being a doctor, or they, see it on like Grey's Anatomy or these TV shows, or they look at sort of the salaries and the lifestyle that physicians live, and they get drawn to the career for those reasons. But I personally feel like if you want to make a lot of money, like, don't go into medicine. There's so many other fields, especially now with technology and AI and computer science, finance, like starting your own business. Like, it's way more lucrative to do that, in my opinion, if you're focused on making as much money as you can, which more power to you. Like, if that's your goal, then you should do that. But I think a lot of people come into medicine sort of with that as a primary goal. And while everybody wants to like make enough money to sustain their family and live comfortably, I think that sometimes can hinder then the grind of the actual training and how focused and, like you said, passionate you really have to be to not get like jaded or burnt out while you're going through it. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, if you're not comfortable being uncomfortable in medicine, it's going to be really challenging to keep going. And what I mean by that is, I think like as a high school student, as an undergrad, things are kind of set up for you. Things are kind of like structured. And as you get more into medical school, and then I know into residency, your schedule is all over the place. You're working all these wacky hours. You're thrown into situations that you definitely don't feel like comfortable or confident in. Like, that's like, I think, a trend I felt Like I was seeing patients 2 months into medical school. Obviously, I wasn't the primary caregiver, but like still, I didn't know what I was doing at all. I felt super uncomfortable. But I think that's part of like the medical sort of training experience is you end up being in these situations that you're not as comfortable in, and it becomes sort of just like you fake it till you make it, but you have to be comfortable or at least try to be as comfortable you can in that environment, if that makes sense. So I would say that's another thing. But I think mainly, I sort of to summarize all that, I have a tendency to be long-winded, so I apologize, but I think to summarize all that, I would say like try other things actually. So for me, like you mentioned, the whole social media experience, I turned that into a business. I ran a business for a year before I went to medical school. And that year, I wasn't doing anything really normally pre-med or medical related. And I learned a lot of different things through that. I had a lot of interest in that, but ultimately I realized there are these things in medicine that I mentioned earlier that really interests me that I couldn't get from the business necessarily. Now in medical school, I feel like I made that decision with more education. Whereas some of my classmates, maybe, or a lot of people I've talked to, they've always wanted to be a doctor. That's the only thing they've done. They've only done pre med things. And now that they're like all the way in it, they're like, oh, maybe I would have liked this, maybe I would have liked that. So I think the other thing is to try different things. And I feel like the younger generation is being forced to make these decisions earlier and earlier and earlier, which I personally think isn't good because I think you need to explore. So that can be very challenging for a student. I don't know. Have you felt that at all? Like feeling forced to like kind of know what you want to do or know what you're going to major in college?
I mean, I experimented with so many electives. Like I still am in high school. Like I took psychology, law, accounting, economics, like computer science. So I kind of got a feel for like different things before kind of figuring out what I wanted to do. But I know so many people that are like, "Oh, accounting sounds boring. I don't want to take it." Or like, I don't think I'll like economics, but they never actually try it or get a feel
Mhm.
for it because you never know if you'll end up liking it or not. Like I've been loving law lately. I know a lot of people, like since grade 9, 10, they've been like, oh yes, like I want to go into neuroscience. Like I know I want to do this, this, and that. I'm like, I don't know how you have it all figured out like this
Mhm.
soon. But I feel like so many people just naturally gear themselves towards like a career in medicine without thinking or like even considering like the other options that they have. So
I think that is almost a disservice to yourself because even if let's say you do these other things, like you take accounting or you take economics or you take law, that's not irrelevant to medicine even if you decide to do it, right? Like law is super important in medicine in terms of like treating patients and getting sued or making sure you're doing things ethically or understanding the insurance companies and all that. Economics, medicine is a business, especially in America. It's a little different in Canada, but it's still like there's an economic component to it, right? So all these different things still are intertwined into the medical system. So even if you're like, I'm dead set on being a doctor, I still think these other things can give you a lot of information that'll help you on your medical journey. On top of the fact that I think it's important to explore these other things just in case you kind of realize you have more of an interest in that, if that makes sense.
I mean, you never know until you try it out too. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's good to kind of consider it before making like a decision, especially if it's something that you're going to be studying for that long. You want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure it's like definitely what you want to be doing. So, specifically, this is kind of geared towards Canadians, but for people that aren't really familiar with like the US healthcare system, what info can you share about for people that are considering it for like medical school or residency or even like working there after your residency?
So honestly, like I'm not too familiar with the Canadian system, so I don't know necessarily the differences. What I do know is in Canada, like if you're a citizen, you have healthcare. In America, that sentence is not true. There's a lot of people who are uninsured, meaning they don't have either insurance privately through like insurance companies or they don't have insurance through like a governmental program. And the reason is it's more of a capitalistic or more of a product consumer based economy, I guess is the best way to say it, in America. What that means is insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, so the companies that deal with the insurance of patients and then the companies that deal with the drugs, end up having a lot of money and then a lot of power and influence on how our systems are run. And I mean, there's a lot of ways I can talk about this. One example I'll give you, I'm talking more about the negative side, I guess, right now, the American healthcare system is if you go into the hospital, you won't most of the time know how much that procedure or however long you're in the hospital costs until the end of the visit. Let's say you go in and you have abdominal pain, you go to the ER, and then they're like, we need to do a surgery. Obviously, you're going to say, okay, let's do the surgery, right? Let's say you do the surgery, and then you're in the hospital after like the hospital inpatient for 2 days, and then you're in the hospital, one more day to watch before you go. So you're 3 days in the hospital, you had surgery. Sometimes you won't even know how much all of that costed till at the end, which is crazy because depending on your insurance, depending on the type of insurance plan you have, you won't know how much you have to pay out of pocket and you won't know how much the insurance company is going to cover for you. So the monetary aspect is actually a huge factor in the American system and it permeates to citizens. The number one cause of bankruptcy in America is medical debt, which is crazy to think about. So the number one reason why people lose all their money is medical debt. And what that does for physicians a lot of times is they want to move outside of these systems because these systems, the hospital systems, the academic systems, they have a lot of different players that are kind of controlling how you actually practice as a physician. So what's big here is like private practice. You kind of run your own clinic. You're like a business owner. You run your clinic and those physicians make a lot more money. That's one way people practice. The second way people practice is like through like a big group at a hospital. I don't kind of like think about Grey's Anatomy. That's like a hospital. And then the third way would be at an academic center. So like I'm at a medical college right now. I have professors and there are physicians who work at the academic center who work as doctors, but then they also teach and they do research and they do other things. So from my understanding right now, which isn't that much, those are sort of the three main ways that physicians practice in America. The big difference for patients is that the insurance coverage isn't like national and there's a lot more people who don't have insurance. And then the other aspect is it's a lot more driven by like private institutions as opposed to in Canada, there's a lot more governmental influence.
Obviously, it's really different, like patient wise, but like
Mhm.
when it comes to working, does it make a difference for like the physician?
I think it depends more on sort of what you want as a physician. I think in America, there's a lot more specialization. There's a lot, you make a lot more money here because there's less governmental influence. Because there isn't national healthcare, one could argue that, like, let's say you're an ER doctor, you're going to see less patients come in with kind of things they don't need to be coming in for, right? I've talked to some Canadian physicians and they've said that's like a common thing. But if you're from Canada and you've trained in the Canadian system, I think you're just as good of a doctor. Like you can practice there. So honestly, I don't even know how much I could say to answer that. I think it's more just a preference. I think the way medicine is practiced from the core values is probably pretty similar. It's just the systems that the physicians are placed in are different. So the little loopholes and things you have to work around are different. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big thing actually that when I was younger in high school and college I didn't understand is in a lot of professions the actual people doing the work are very similar skill or talent, but the systems they're put in which they operate can be drastically different. So then it makes it seem to people like, oh, these doctors are here, these doctors are there, and they're doing different things. But it's just the labels or the system they're working in. It's basically the same thing. The compensation might be different. Maybe there's a little bit more opportunity here or there, but I think overall it's pretty similar. It's just kind of like what system would you want to work in? Where do you want to live?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. That makes sense. So, in terms of like your social media, how has that kind of influenced the academic journeys of the high school students and also the undergrad students that follow you?
I don't know. I you have to ask them. I think for me, like I kind of started it more. I was bored. Like it was the pandemic, and I didn't really have much to do. And one of my really like my best friend from middle school, he does social media for a living. Like he has his own business. That's like he's like literally in a career right now for his social media business. And he kind of came to me. And he was like, "Hey, like you should just like start posting. Like do something that's different." So I kind of thought a little bit about it and I was like, oh, maybe I can post about school. And then somehow the videos sort of took off. I think what I've tried to do with the videos is give an honest perspective, especially now on like what things are like in medical school, be authentic, try not to like sort of romanticize it or also make it look like it's the worst thing in the world. Cause I think that's something I see on social media a lot. And then the big thing was like the scholarships talking about student financial aid, student debt. Basically what I try to do is talk about things that maybe if you go to a really good public school or you have parents who are educated seem like things that are really obvious, but there's a lot of students, there's a lot of people who don't have those resources, and try to share some of those things that I had as an advantage to people who maybe hadn't heard about it. So like in the US system, FAFSA is like a student financial aid system that students apply to when they go to college in order to get financial aid from the government or get loans for school. Some people don't even know that exists. So I talked about that. I talked about different scholarships. Then, so that was phase one. And then as you get a following, then you start to get business opportunities. So I was able to create my own scholarships, for example, and give them back to students. So I've given away five $1,000 scholarships over the last 2 to 3 years to five different students to support their academic journeys. And then I've worked with some companies to do like the brand deal side and kind of support myself financially. I think through that, I can speak maybe more on what I learned. I think the biggest thing I learned is like personal branding and being able to communicate information is a skill that everybody needs now. With everything becoming digital, right? I always explain to like, I used to explain this to my clients, like why they should hire me to like invest money into their social media. Think about this. When you're watching TV and the commercials come on, which companies have paid tens of thousands, millions of dollars to pay for, what do most people do? They go on their phones. They're going to look at the ads on their phones. So you might as well go to people where they're at, where they're actually paying attention. And now it's getting worse and worse, or better and better, depending on what side of the coin you're on. And what people, scientists, physicians, academics are realizing is they have to learn how to use social media in order to get their message out. And we're starting to see these big scientists, big platforms, at least in America, like really blow up and get a lot of attention about science, because people are starting to realize now that that's where people go for their information. And what's been really interesting is in medical school, a lot of professors and physicians and people I would consider mentors, I've actually been helping them with like their social media and how do I use it as a researcher. So it's been a really cool tool that kind of got my foot in the door. I think with some opportunities in medical school, I maybe wouldn't have had that chance if I didn't have this little thing, in my pocket. I could, sort of say, hey, I can help you with this, if that makes sense.
I mean, in my case, like I've found so many like extracurriculars or like research programs or nonprofits, like organizations that have accounts on social media. So I feel like it's so easy to like access things through that. So it's definitely a tool to like find different opportunities and things.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, in terms of undergrad, how beneficial is a degree from an Ivy League or like an elite school for someone that wants to apply to med school? Like, does the competitiveness of your undergrad program really matter?
I would say for like 90 to 95% of people, no. I'll start on the 5% or 5 to 10%. If you're somebody who wants to go to a top 10 medical school in the country, like you're like, I don't want to go to med school unless I go to Harvard, or I don't want to go to med school unless I go to Cambridge, or whatever. The top schools in the world, top schools in Canada. Then going to a top school is going to help your chances, but then you have to make sure you succeed at that school as well, right? That would be my caveat. Or if you get a scholarship to a top school, if going to that top school is the most affordable way for you to go to school, you're closer to home, whatever the reason, that would be the second reason. From a purely academic standpoint, to me, it does not matter at all. Not at all. And unless you go to those top 10 schools, top 15 schools, maybe, you don't really even have a competitive advantage, because the medical school process, they're looking at your MCAT scores, they're looking at your Casper scores, they're looking at your even for really, like, they're looking at the involvements you've had, right? You could almost argue if you were one of the top students at maybe a university that was ranked less versus an average student at one of the top universities, you're going to have more opportunities at that average university if you're one of the top students, because you're going to stand out. So all the clubs you apply to, you're going to get applications for. All the people you interact with are going to be really interested in working with you. From my perspective, I've been very strong opinionated about this on my social media platform, and I've gotten a lot of mixed messages from people. But I really feel strongly about this, especially for medical school. And I like that you asked that question. If you're talking about another field, my answer probably would change. But for medical school, the undergraduate program doesn't matter. In fact, some could argue that even your medical school program doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, you're applying for residency, and maybe your residency will help you get your first job. But then after that, that doesn't even matter, because it's about how well did you work at your first job, right? So I know you didn't ask this, but I kind of want to talk about it a little bit. I think this whole thing is really overrated. And as you get farther and farther along in the process, you start to realize like, oh, I was so worried about what college I went to and where they were on the world ranking report and blah blah blah, and you kind of realize how irrelevant that is, especially if you're going to do graduate school. Because once you start medical school, I don't care where you went to college. That doesn't matter. You're all your classmates, right? With your peers. And you don't want the person in your class that's the snobby one that's acting like they're better because they went to a university with a big name.
If you're applying to med school after, then nobody really looks at your like undergrad later down the road, I guess. So, how beneficial would you say a pre-med program is compared to other science-based programs for someone that wants to apply to med school?
I definitely think there are some advantages, but then there also are some disadvantages. I think the advantage is if you're at a pre-grad program, the advisors and the people sort of directing you on your college journey have a lot, probably more experience with getting students into medical school. So you're going to have more opportunities to do things that are great for your resume or sort of prepare you to think at when you are in medical school. I was in a pre-med program at Ohio State, and I had those advantages. I was surrounded by students who were really intelligent and kind of pushed me. So that was the positive. But I do think there's a negative, which is when you're in a pre-med program, everybody's all about, okay, what can I do to get into medical school? And the whole point to me also of going to college is all the other things you learn, right? And what I said earlier, exposing yourself to different disciplines and learning different skills, taking different courses. So I think when you're in a pre-med program, it can be really easy to silo yourself into, okay, I need to do these 5, 6 things to get into medical school, that you forget about the step that you're currently in, right? Like you're still a college student. You need to do college things. You need to enjoy college, explore college, take different courses, right? I still think that's extremely important as a pre-med student. So a lot of that then comes down to the mentality of the student themselves, right? You can be in a pre-med program and do those things. But I found myself and a lot of my peers kind of falling into that first sort of option I was talking about earlier about how, about really just getting way too hyper focused on the pre-med stuff and kind of not seeing the bigger picture as much. So like anything, there are positive and negatives. I think if you're really, really interested in medicine and you're looking for that guidance, it can be a great option for you. But by no means is that necessary or the only path to get there. My classmates in medical school have such a diverse range of backgrounds, from working for 5 to 10 years before starting medical school to coming straight out of medical school, different majors. And I've really enjoyed that. And I find oftentimes the students who had these diverse experiences or worked or had different majors have even cooler perspectives now that they're in medicine. I always say, like, if I could do it again, I would like major in business and just take the pre-med classes along with it, because I would have got like the best of both worlds. But who knows if I'd be in the same position if I did that, right? So you never know. But I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Yeah, don't feel like you need to do that.
I've had a lot of people recommend doing like a minor in some sort of business thing, like taking the
Mm-hmm.
electives for that. So you kind of have a plan B or a backup in case you don't end up going into medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you decide which medical schools to apply to? And what factors were really important to you when it came to making your final decision?
It's a good question. I applied to a bunch of different schools because the admissions rate here is like it's like 1 to 5% max for like the students most places. So like you kind of just have to like apply everywhere. I kind of did it based off the scores that I had and like what that would sort of qualify me for. And then I had like stretch schools where maybe the average score is higher than my score. I had, most of them were like kind of in the range. And then I had a few like safety, which doesn't exist in medical school, but like basically like my qualifications were above their average, just basically strictly based off stats. Then you wait for interviews. I ended up getting 4 interviews. I got rejected by 2 schools right away. I got waitlisted by my third after my third interview, and then I got accepted straight up at my fourth interview, and then I ended up getting off the wait list. So I got 2 acceptances, 2 rejections. So I only had to choose between two, and it was between my alma mater and then where I'm currently at right now. And I ended up basically staying here. I ended up getting a scholarship, which is a big reason why I stayed. But before I got that scholarship, I had to think about where I wanted to go. I wanted to be close to family, honestly. Medical school is really rough. It's extremely challenging. It's extremely time consuming. I'm really happy I made that decision. I live 20 minutes away from my parents. I can go home and eat dinner. I can, go to dinner with my mom, right? Like, it's just like, it's really nice to have that. And then a big thing I think in medical schools is thinking about the culture. You don't want to be somewhere where it's super competitive if that's not your vibe. I'm a very laid back, like I do my own thing. And the MCW, Medical College of Wisconsin, the culture here is amazing, super collaborative. Everybody's so nice. People aren't competitive, they're helping each other. So that was a big thing for me. And then the third thing I would say is you want to look at, actually there's two more things. This is a big thing actually. If you're applying to medical school, see if the school has a hospital on campus. A lot of medical schools, what people don't realize, they have a school, but then where students actually rotate to when they're doing their rotations are 30, 40, 50 minutes away. So you end up having to do all this driving and traveling. Medical College of Wisconsin is like the biggest hospital system in this city, so everything is right here, which was huge. And then the last thing is you want to look a little bit at, like, if you know what you want to do, this is especially important. I don't really know what specialty I want to go into, but you want to look a little bit at the residency matching and kind of see, like, where are people matching, what specialties are they matching in, how well are they matching. So I looked at all those things between Ohio State and Medical College of Wisconsin, basically all the same. The residency matching was the same. Culture was very similar. I had, sort of roots to both places. Ultimately ended up being finances and being close to family for me. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Like, you should think about this. It's not, you're going to be here for 4 years. It's going to be for most people, pivotal years, right? Even if if you, let's say you take 1 to 4 gap years, this is, your late 20s, early 20s to early 30s, right? These are like pivotal years. A lot's happening during this time period. So I do think it's something you should think about. A lot of people don't have a choice. Most people don't have a choice. And even if you do have a choice, it's usually between like a few places. So that's another thing to, I guess, consider. And in that case, you just have to choose between what you get. But yeah, that was sort of my thought process.
So, specifically during kind of like the application process, are there any common mistakes that you see a lot of pre-med students making, or even that you made?
I think the first thing I would say is you should be able to live with what you wrote in your essays. I think a lot of people are like so worried, like, how should I write this? Like, what do they want me to write, right? Like, how am I going to write this so I can appease the people reading, right? And you definitely have to do a little bit of that, right? I'm not saying you just completely do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, like, you should be proud of what essays you wrote, how you sort of put yourself on paper, right? And you should be able to live with that. So, like, if you get rejected or it doesn't go the way that you want, you're like, you know what? I gave it my best shot. This isn't the best. So at least you can leave with that. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is, if you apply to a bunch of schools, there's so many essays you have to write. You don't think about that. So pre-writing essays, I didn't do that. I definitely should have done that, because by the end, everything became so robotic because I was just exhausted mentally. And I think that definitely hindered me. With regards to interviewing, I really think I had a very interesting experience with interviewing, because I've always found myself to be pretty outgoing, charismatic person. So I thought I'd have no issues with interviewing. And I think I probably didn't prepare enough for my first two interviews. But I think more than that, it's not taking it personally. Some schools are looking for a specific type of person. If you don't fit that mold, you're not going to get accepted. So some people will say you should fit the mold, get accepted, so then you have that as an option. I'm not like that. I'm more like, I'm going to be myself. Again, I want to leave the interview feeling like proud of what I put out there, right? So that if I get accepted or rejected, I can live with myself. So I went with that route. And I think that might have rubbed some schools the wrong way. But what it ended up doing, kind of implicitly, is it selected for the school that I actually fit at. Is this making sense? Like,
Yeah.
MCW saw my personality, saw the way I was, saw my interests. I talked a lot about social media in my interview. Some of the schools were really scared of that. I'm sure a lot of schools were scared of that. Some of the schools asked about it at interviews, but not in like a positive way, in a very negative way, which was very surprising to me. And I think I was like taken aback by that. And obviously I didn't end up getting into those schools. The two schools I got into were very positive, very interested in sort of the perspective I had. And I'm really glad, I ended up doing it that way, because now I'm at this school and the culture that I felt at the interview is the culture of the school that I'm at. So I think that's one of the things I accidentally did well. I didn't even know that was really that's just kind of how I am. I would say that's something. I think the biggest thing though is what I said before: do a little extra prep and don't take it personally. right? I got rejected by 22 schools, right? I only got into two. Only got into two is a lot, right? Like I'm so happy and I got lucky that I got into two schools, in all honesty, with how competitive things are. So try not to take things personally when you start to get the rejections. It's really, really hard to do it. Especially like after an interview. You're like, what? Like I thought I killed it. You probably did kill it. You just weren't the right fit. So those were the two things I think I sort of learned that I didn't do well. In the beginning I took things personally and it was really hard, honestly. But yeah.
I mean, yeah, like what you said, it's really important to like stay true to yourself in the interview because then you kind of end up going to the school that's a proper fit for you
Hmm.
and like your interests. So I guess that like ended up being better.
Yeah. Let me say one more thing. Stay off the forums. Don't read the Student Doctor Network and the Reddit. And my God, like that was terrible for me. I was like reading on all those, like, oh, they interviewed on the same day as me and they already got accepted. Why haven't I heard back? Like, oh my God, because you're waiting months before you hear back from some of these schools, right? So you're just antsy, like you just want to know. And you think reading all these things are going to make you feel better. Nope, they do not. They make you feel way worse. So try your best to stay off those. It's really hard to. I did a good job in the beginning and then I just like folded at one point.
So, how do you maintain a sort of work-life balance while pursuing such a demanding career?
These are really good questions, Suani. I think that is one of the biggest things I struggled with still. I'm trying to figure out in medical school is how to maintain that balance. I think the first thing is what I just said, like being okay with the fact that maybe you don't have it all together. Like I had to just accept that. Working on work life balance slowly. So not trying to have every part of your life balanced perfectly right at the same time. Like add one thing here and one thing there, and slowly and steadily you'll build it up in an organic way that's actually sustainable. For me, the biggest things are setting aside time. I'm a morning person. So like I usually get up pretty early and I set aside like 30 minutes to an hour in the morning to do like my like morning routine, right? And I almost never miss it. And for me, that gets my mind right for the day. During my morning routine, I'm basically setting my mindset for the day, trying to like make sure I remember like this is an amazing opportunity that I've been given, right? To be in medical school. I have an opportunity to learn today. My whole job is to learn. That's pretty cool. And so I try to frame myself to look at this as not, oh my God, I have all this work to do. And it's way overwhelming. And mind you, that still happens. This week is crazy. We're learning like all of the visual system, all of the auditory system, and all of the vestibular, which is like your balance in 1 week. And then all of seizures, all of headaches, and all the drugs for those two. That's just 1 week. And we have a midterm on Monday, right? So like it's an insane amount of content. And I definitely feel overwhelmed throughout the day. But if I didn't set my intention or set my brain right in the morning, I'd be screwed. For me, it's a must. So that's the biggest thing. I think the second thing I've realized is you have to get active every day. So whether it's running, working out, just going on a walk, doing something, like for me, I've realized that's a big part of my balance. And then I'm close to home. So I have friends, family, loved ones right around here, and I can hang out with them when I need a pick me up or when I just need a mental break. So those have been the three things I think for me that have kind of kept me sane, kept me on the right track, helped me look at things in a healthy way. Because ultimately, I think that's the only, this is just my personal opinion, it's the only way to actually have work life balance. If you're going between hating school to just having like distractions, it's always just going to be this hating school and having distractions. I think to me, you have to learn how to develop, and this takes so much time. I still haven't mastered this, or still am not really good at this yet. You have to learn how to look at what you're doing in a healthy way so that when you're actually doing it, you don't feel like this sucks. That's what I never got right in college. It was always, I want to have fun or I'm doing my schoolwork. And I didn't realize like I could figure out how to make school a little bit more interesting or look at it in a more healthy way.
I'm sure it's helpful to kind of learn that earlier on, especially because it's such like a demanding job and career. Just having that work-life balance and like that routine, I'm sure it helps like in the long run too. Like once you
Yeah.
start like working.
Yeah. But even for you, like if you could start to look at your school that way as like, I need to get this assignment done, right? By 11:59 for my assignment. But if you are noticing you're getting overwhelmed, or when you go to college and you notice you're getting over, because this happens at every stage of education. If you can start to look at it as like how can I find some meaning through this work, or how can I like see the bigger picture and remember that as you're doing it, it can really help and make that actual studying more enjoyable. That's one of my biggest pet peeves, is like all the videos and the work life balance and all the nonsense. All of it online is just like, how do you take a break? And I think that's not the right way to think about it. You need your breaks. I think we need to be thinking about how can we start to look at things in a less pessimistic way. This is just a hot take opinion. I found tremendous benefit when I'm able to do it.
I mean, especially because you're like studying and working for so many hours in a day. I mean, you don't want to hate it if you're doing it for like all that time. This is kind of a little bit similar, but if you could go back and give your high school self or even your college self a little bit of advice, what would you
Mhm.
say? I'm sure it's hard to narrow it down to like one thing, but
Yeah, there would be a lot. I would say do it your own way. Actually, that's what I would tell myself. Do it your own way. You don't have to do it the way everybody's doing it. There's not one path to success. There's not one path to being a doctor. I really feel this. There's not one correct way, and if you don't hit all those points, you're not going to achieve your goal. There's so many paths to get to your goal, and you should do it in the way that kind of what we were talking about before. You're right, Sonny. That gives you fulfillment. And if you don't know what that is, well, then you need to spend time finding that, right? And that's what I think I missed for a good portion of college and high school. Was I was just doing things because I thought I wasn't even doing it for myself. I was just doing it because I thought it would be what I'm supposed to do, right? As opposed to, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I'm interested in. This is what I'm going to invest time in. It may work, it may not. I may achieve the goal that I want to, I may not, but I can live with it because I'm enjoying what's happening right now. Enjoying doesn't always mean things are going to be easy, but I try my best to do that, right? And obviously, I still will do things just to do it, right? Or I get caught up in the nonsense. It happens. Obviously, it's going to happen. But that's what I would tell myself is do it your own way, right? So I'm hoping this podcast you're doing is because you really enjoy it, and you're learning a lot from it, and you get to have these cool conversations. And you never know what'll come from that, right? You know, what opportunities, what other experiences, what other interests you'll have. So I think it's cool that you're doing that, and like continue to think about it like that. Like, I'm going to do it my own way. And the people that I found now at my stage, which, as you said, is still the beginning of my training, so I'm going to learn this more and more. But the people I found to really enjoy it, they've done it their own way, right? There's a lot of students who don't enjoy medical school, and it's because they're still caught up in that like undergrad high school mentality, like that pre-med mentality of like, I have to do all these things, otherwise I'm not going to get my goal, and if I don't get my goal, right, and then it's like the tweaking starts mentally, like everybody just starts going crazy. So I've been on both sides, right? In high in med, I've talked about this in my account. In undergrad, like I had anxiety, OCD, like I had to go see a doctor, a therapist, like I had to do all of that because I was overwhelmed by all the tweaking. Like I just didn't know how to handle it. And now I'm in this position where I'd never want to be back there again. So I'm trying my best to kind of like do it my own way, and we'll see what happens. So
I mean, obviously, like nobody else's like path is going to be exactly the same as yours. Like it's not one linear or like one single path that you're taking to your end goal because obviously your end goal might not be like exactly the same as someone else's, right? So,
mhm,
I mean, it's kind of on your own to figure out. So, yeah, for
mhm.
sure. Well, thank you so much. That was so helpful. It was really, really nice to have you.
Yep. Thank you for having me on too.